Dokey. Yeah. Okay. Now, may have wanted to wait on hitting record until I had the lecture up, but whatever. Okay. Just a reminder for you guys online, your paper proposals due tonight by midnight, essentially. All right, elections. More fun in an election year, of course, right? We get to talk about what's coming up. Presidential election years, especially, this can be quite interesting. Okay, so what is an election, right? We talk about it, but what is it? It's picking who gets to be in charge of the Senate or the House, or who gets to be president or governor. And so candidates, of course, have to campaign. They have to go out and meet people, not this year, obviously, that's a bit different. But there's usually campaign events, rallies, campaign ads. We're already seeing some campaign ads here in the Valley. Things like going to the various state fairs. It's tradition that every candidate makes an appearance at the Iowa State Fair, basically when they're going to run and then after they get nominated. This year, of course, that's not going to happen, but usually the big stops are the Iowa State Fair and a diner in Nashua, New Hampshire, where you eat a piece of pie and talk to the voters. The voting isn't logical, right? It's your one vote probably isn't going to decide who wins. It's pretty rare to have an election where it comes down to a handful of votes. It usually only happens on the local level. So for most people, why vote, right? Your one vote probably, logically speaking, isn't going to affect the outcome of the election. So why would you do it, right? Why? Well, part of it is because of ideology, right? If you are a lifelong Democrat or a lifelong Republican, you're going to show up to vote every election. You're going to want to make sure your candidate wins. If you're someone who is conservative, you're going to want to make sure your candidates win. So part of it is a feeling about the system. How do you feel about a candidate? How do you feel about a particular policy? And part of it is just habit. You go in and you vote the first time, you're just going to keep on voting, right? Once you've established a pattern of regular voting, you're more likely than not to keep doing it. And also part of it is just you're taught from a young age that it is your duty to vote, right? We have Mr. Bowden here emphasizing the need to vote. So we're taught from a young age that it's our civic duty, that it's an act of patriotism, that you should participate in the political system. Some of it is just, well, my whole family votes, so I'm going to go and vote with them. And also, basically, if there's no participation, then how do we know an election is legitimate? How do we know it wasn't rigged? In a local election, like mayor, we're lucky to see maybe 10% voter turnout. How easy would it be to tamper with that election? If the majority of the people didn't vote, how do they know it's a fraudulent election? They don't, right? You could have someone declaring themselves the winner of an election and nobody being able to tell them you didn't actually win. So it does lead to questions of legitimacy. So it's important to vote even though it's not logical. it doesn't make sense in some ways to vote, but it's really important to do so because it helps keep the election process fair and open. And also, and this of course excludes people who can't vote for religious reasons or because they're not citizens or whatever. If you don't vote, you can't complain about the outcome of the election. If you didn't like the fact that Donald Trump won in 2016, but you didn't vote, too bad, right? I mean, you didn't show up on election day. You didn't show how you felt one way or the other, so it's hard to say, well, how can you complain if you don't vote? Okay. In terms of the right to vote, originally, only white, wealthy men with property were allowed to vote. Also, only white men with acceptable religious views. So you had to be Christian, male, and have a fair amount of property. So of course, voting was severely restricted at the beginning of the country. Only about 5% of a population of 4 million were allowed to vote. And so of course that's reflected in the leadership. The first presidents tended to be white, wealthy men. And then eventually in the 1820s, they removed the property ownership rule. So we saw more white men getting the right to vote. Okay, so first attempt at getting more people to the polls. And also, of course, you can't require people to belong to a certain church or religion to be able to vote. So then we get the 15th Amendment, which gives African American men the right to vote. The 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. And the 26th Amendment, which lowers the voting age from 21 to 18. And they did this because at the time, this was during the height of the Vietnam War. And the argument was, if I can be drafted and sent to war, why can't I vote for the president? Right? It doesn't make sense to tell someone you're old enough to be sent to war, but you're not old enough to vote for the president. So they lowered the voting age, hoping it would mollify some of the protesters and redirect their anger to the voting booth. You don't like President Johnson, show up and vote. So it makes sense, right? If you're eligible for the draft, if you can be sent to jail for the rest of your natural life, you should have the right to help pick the next president. But just because you have the right to vote doesn't necessarily mean you're gonna be able to vote. Throughout most of the South, especially for minorities, there were issues with things like poll taxes, literacy tests, and white-only primaries that didn't allow minorities the right to vote. In the movie Selma, about the civil rights movement, there's a scene where Oprah Winfrey's character goes in to register to vote, and she gets asked a handful of questions, and she's able to answer them. And then I asked her to name basically all the members of the state board of education or something like that, all 51 judges or something, right? Deliberate attempts to keep people from being able to vote, putting up barriers to make it harder for them to participate. And also issues with what they call the paper bag test. You could pass for white if your skin tone was essentially that of a paper bag or lighter. So if you passed the paper bag test, you weren't going to have much trouble being able to get into white clubs, hotels, things like that. But if your skin was a bit darker, get it, you weren't getting in. Yes. Yeah, off the top of my head, the 19th was in 1920. The 26th, God, I should know what years they were off the top of my head, but I don't. So I'm going to cheat and get out my pocket copy of the Constitution and tell you the exact year. I should know them, I just don't off the top of my head. Okay, so 19th Amendment was in 1920. The 15th Amendment was 1870, and the 26th Amendment was in 1971. Yeah.
I was thinking 1970.
I was thinking, yeah, 1970 or 71. I wasn't sure, but yeah, 1971. Of course, I know that the 19th Amendment, 1920, because we're celebrating 100 years of women's suffrage. Yeah. Sorry, I don't know the dates of most ratifications of most amendments off the top of my head. I'm like, some of them I've got, but not all. It is. Yeah, I mean, women have only had the right to vote for 100 years. Most minorities only 55 years with the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So it's very recent history in a lot of ways, yeah, absolutely. Of course, the ironic thing is, in the 1970s, prior to 1971, you could be 18 to drink but 21 to vote, and then of course that flipped, right? You can be 18 to vote, but you have to be 21 to drink, which makes no sense to me whatsoever. Here we are. Okay. So, voter registration, of course, is important, right? We need to know how many people are eligible to vote in a particular state, about how many estimated voters there are, and also to make sure that only people who are qualified to vote do so. So you can't be mentally incapacitated. You have to be 18 on or before Election Day, and of course you have to be a citizen. So if you're someone who's in a mental health facility, you may or may not have the right to vote. If your IQ is under 70, you're not likely to be able to vote. There's also issues with felons and the right to vote. In some states, the right to vote can be restored through a judge or a court order. Florida recently passed a constitutional amendment giving felons the right to vote, but they have to pay off any legal fines or fees before they can vote. So it depends on the state. In some states, once you've gone through your parole/probation period, you are eligible to vote again if you've been convicted of a felony. Okay. Texas used to charge a poll tax of about $1.50. By today's standards, that's not a lot of money, but we're talking a period of time where most people maybe made $1 an hour, a little over, so pretty significant chunk of money. So minorities and poor people weren't eligible to vote. So the federal government helped pass the 24th Amendment, which eliminated the poll tax. You cannot charge someone to register to vote, nor can you charge them to actually vote. It has to be completely free. Unfortunately, here in Texas, we do not do online voter registration. I do think that is a bit of an unfair burden because you may have to download the form, fill it out, sign it, send it in to someone, right? Makes it a little harder. Would be easier if we allowed for online registration, where you just go to a website and get registered to vote. States like Massachusetts allow that. There's no reason why Texas couldn't do that, but they haven't. They also used to say you could only register to vote from October 1st to January 31st. Yeah, that's not going to be allowed either. You have up until 28 days before an election in most states to register to vote. Here it's about 30. So you can't say only these ones going to get registered to vote because people don't necessarily remember that. So here in Texas, to vote, you have to be 18 by election day. You have to be a resident of your precinct, a resident of the state and the county at least 30 days before the election. So let's say you move to Texas on October 14th. Sorry, but you're going to need to get an absentee ballot from your former state. You're not going to be able to register to vote. Also, you have to be a resident of the election precinct. If you move, you need to re-register to vote because you're probably in a different precinct. If you show up to the wrong precinct, they will usually let you know and say you're in the wrong place. So you want to double check your election precinct and make sure you go to the right place. Now, this doesn't apply to early voting. With early voting, you can vote anywhere in the county that has a polling station. It's only on election day that you are required to vote in your precinct. You have to have registered to vote at least 30 days before the election. And if you're convicted of a felony but you haven't finished out your sentence, you can't vote. And there was a case recently, there was a woman who'd been convicted of a felony for tax fraud, I believe, got out of jail and went to vote. Did not realize that she had to finish her probationary period first. So she showed up and was asking about voting, and then she said, well, I've been convicted of a felony, can I vote? And they said no, so she left. But she was arrested for voter fraud and sentenced to 5 years in jail for attempting to vote. Which, yeah, is a bit harsh, because obviously it's not like she knew that she was breaking the law. She didn't actually vote. At the most, it should have been a fine, maybe like 20 days in jail, but 5 years is a bit extreme. Okay, so it's one thing to get registered to vote. It's one thing to say you're going to vote. It's a completely different thing to actually show up on election day. So what we look at on election day is how many people actually participated. All of the pundits on election day, once they cut through the bladder, will actually talk about what they're seeing in terms of voter turnout. So it's a portion of people who actually show up on election day. Out of 40 million registered voters in the state, how many of them actually showed up to vote? And so here in Texas, we're not that great in terms of showing up to vote. The average is about 48% voter turnout for a presidential election. It hit a little under 54% in 2008, but in 2008, voter turnout was high across the country, especially for minorities and young people who were enthusiastic about Barack Obama. It then dropped to 53% in 2012, and it was about 51.5% in 2016. so not that great. Midterm elections, which is when we re-elect the entire House of Representatives, a third of the Senate, and occasionally the governor. That's even lower. It was 30% in 2006, 30% in 2010, 28% in 2014, but it hit 46% in 2018, which is still low, but that's actually higher than it has been in quite a while. We did see some emotion playing into turnout for the midterm elections of 2018. And it's even worse for the local elections. Mayor, city council, maybe 10% of the voters, maybe. Part of that is because local elections are held in the spring of odd-numbered years, so it's a separate election. Most voters aren't aware there's an election, and quite frankly, most voters don't really care unless it's a presidential election. Yes. Nothing. They can't really do anything about it. They can encourage people to show up to vote, but they can't really do anything about the fact that people don't show up. There's no penalty for not voting, so it's just, you didn't show up. Oh, no, okay. I'm sorry? Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. More often than not, it's to the incumbents' advantage if people don't show up to vote. Yeah, definitely. If you're only getting about 10% voter turnout, but that 10% is your supporters, oh yeah, it's definitely to their advantage. More often than not, it's the person who's challenging for the seat who's pushing to get out the vote, because they want their people to show up to vote. So yeah, for the incumbent, they're like, he didn't show up, I still won, I don't care. So yeah, for them, it is a bit of an advantage. Yeah. And also, if you are going to pull off a fraudulent election, you don't want people showing up, right? You're going to steal the mayor's race to your benefit if nobody shows up. It's very cynical, I realize, but that's the reality of the situation. Yeah, good questions. Any other questions? Okay. Any questions online? So, why don't we vote, right? Why is the percentage low? Well, nationally, part of the problem, of course, is that our election is held on a Tuesday, and most people have school and work, right? It's not a national holiday. We all still have to go to work. We still have to go to school. So it makes it harder for people to be able to vote. Honestly, one of the solutions I've heard is make Election Day a federal holiday. Close down the schools, close down those businesses, give people the day off to vote. I'm not saying it'll necessarily be a huge increase, but it would help a little bit, at least. The other problem here in Texas is we do have high levels of poverty. It's about 15.5% of Texans living in poverty, so we're higher than the national average. We also rank about 9th in terms of the highest poverty rate in the U.S. And that does cause a problem. lack of education. If you don't know how to register to vote, if you don't know anything about the candidates, if you don't know how to look up the polling place. Also, if you are someone who works multiple jobs, you may not be able to take the time off on election day. If you have kids, maybe you can't afford a babysitter to stand in line and vote. So it does unfortunately tend to decrease voter turnout. The more income you make, the more likely you are to vote, because you might work a 9-to-5 job and you could go before or after work. There's also, of course, the fact that white Texans do tend to show up to vote in higher numbers compared to minorities. Why that is, I'm not completely sure. Part of it is tied to income, and I think part of it is tied to the history of voter suppression that we're still trying to work to deal with. If you require people to have a driver's license or state ID to vote, you do kind of knock people out of contention, right? Senior citizens may not be able to vote. Poor people may not be able to vote. Now, the exception to this rule was 2008, but part of that was because we had the first African-American presidential candidate, so African-Americans were inspired to show up at the polls. But statistically speaking, we do tend to see white Texans showing up to vote. So what this means is more liberal viewpoints are left out of the discussion. People tend to look at Texas and say, oh, it's a conservative Republican state. Not necessarily, right? Texas is on the verge of becoming a swing state. It's probably going to become purple in the next couple of years. But minorities have to show up to vote for that to be really seen. Because the assumption is Texas is conservative, liberal, moderate viewpoints aren't necessarily taken into consideration. Although currently polls are actually showing that Trump and Biden are in a bit of a dogfight over this state right now. And if somehow Joe Biden won Texas, that would be huge. I mean, they would be talking about that for months on end. I mean, the pundits would be in absolute shock if that actually happened. It would be quite entertaining to watch in some ways to see that. And so part of the way that would happen is if Democrats and liberals got minority participation, if the Democrats were able to get minorities to show up to vote, if people here in the Valley voted. It's estimated that we've got about 1.4 million people in the Valley. If even half of them showed up to vote, that could make a huge difference in the outcome of the election. So Democrats need minorities to show up to vote. 44% of Hispanics, 78% of blacks, in a 2013 survey identified as Democrats, as liberals. And so if Democrats can get minorities and young people to the polls, they might have a chance at winning, might. But they've got to find a way to get them out, because they're not doing quite a good enough job of that. And part of that I blame on the party. 2018, there was the governor's race, right? We had Lupe Valdez versus Greg Abbott. I never saw one campaign ad for Valdez here in the Valley. She never ran a single ad down here. But Abbott did. How can you expect people to show up to vote if you're not even running ads, right? You're the Democratic candidate. You should be spending some money down here. What are you doing, you know? You can't ignore this era. I'm sure most people have no idea who the Democratic candidate even was down here, right? Yeah. And she was actually the first openly gay Democratic candidate for a major office here in Texas. And we didn't even know about her because nobody on her campaign said, oh, maybe we should pay attention to the ballot. So part of the Democrats are not doing their jobs down here.
We're also not known
Yeah.
as San Antonio. They think San Antonio is south.
That's true.
Maybe people out in the north side and stuff. Oh, I'm from South Texas, and oh, you're from San Antonio, but
No.
they
South
South Texas stops until they hear hurricanes coming in and they're in South Texas, Brownsville.
Yeah.
Until they recognize it, but other than that, a lot of people don't recognize Texas.
Yeah, I'm convinced there are people in the north part of the state that think we're part of Mexico here.
Mhm.
I mean, they really just don't pay attention to their geography, right? Texas is a huge freaking state. I mean, they just don't pay attention to the rest of it. You know, it's like Dallas, Austin, Houston, San Antonio, nothing else exists, right?
El Paso.
Maybe.
El Paso.
Maybe.
You know, on that
Yeah.
side of Texas.
Yeah.
Other than that.
Yeah. And it's unfortunate because I think if Democrats did spend some time and money down here, they could win.
Mm-hmm.
They have to show up down here. You know, they can't ignore this part of the state. I mean, they could win. They just don't pay attention. And
It's like, I'm pretty sure the only time that you know there was Rio Grande Valley is up here above the fence.
yeah, right.
I mean,
Yeah.
I see it funny because my kids have traveled
Mm-hmm.
and they said, oh, where are you from? And South Texas is like, oh, Austin, Antonio,
And I'm guilty of that because when I was first applying for a job here and they called me for an interview, I was like, where's this college? Okay, where's that? I'm looking at a map. I'm like, oh, okay, that's where that is. Because people don't know this area, right? They don't think about that in Texas. So I was like, where's the heck? Okay, now I get it.
Yeah. It's difficult a lot of now the people from San Antonio now realize where the Rio Grande Valley is. But
Yeah.
back when I was there, we didn't know. They thought San Antonio was the lowest point.
Yeah. And some people do know about McAllen, at least because it has been in the news and everything, when Trump said it was a dangerous city and the mayor was like, we're the 10th safest city in the United States. What are you talking about?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, other than that, most people don't, outside of hell, even in Texas, don't know where we are. Okay. All right, so if you're going to run for office, you're going to need a lot of help. You're going to need people. You need someone to run your campaign. You need a campaign manager. You need a speechwriter, someone to help raise the money, to organize your schedule, to do opposition research, talk about what position on an issue you're going to take. So the very top people are going to be professional, seasoned, political analysts, political junkies, people who work in professional politics. But you also need volunteers. You need people to show up at a rally, to hand out campaign literature, get people registered, call people, take people to the polls on election day, have a volunteer go to a senior care facility in a van and take senior citizens to vote, right? Show up in a neighborhood that doesn't have public transportation and get people to the polls. Make it clear what your candidate stands for. So campaigns love volunteers. They freaking love them. Also, they love college students. They love you guys because, one, you're young, you're enthusiastic, and they're just happy to have you. Now, obviously, this year is an exception because, yeah, usually in an election year, if you showed up and said, I'm here to volunteer, they would be like, yay, and then you get like free campaign stuff, and they would be very happy to have you. I did some campaigning for the Iowa caucus in 2004. I was going door to door in January, which really not the best idea, but great experience, right? Knocking on doors, asking people to vote for my candidate, things like that. And it's beneficial, of course, for the campaign because it saves money if you get a bunch of volunteers to do the work. but it's also good for us. We learn about the hard work that goes into an election. We see what happens behind the scenes. We don't see the finished, polished image. We see talking to the candidates, the decisions that get made, where do we put money here, things like that. You also learn to tolerate other viewpoints, how to argue for your candidate. And you also realize it's not the end of the world if your candidate loses. It sucks, of course, you don't want them to lose, but you understand it's not the end of the world. And you also understand that things aren't miraculously going to improve if your candidate wins, right? Obama comes into office at the height of the terrible recession. Things weren't going to turn around in 2 days, right? It took the better part of a year. So if you volunteer, you can understand more about how this actually works. You can get a better understanding. Okay, so I see a question from Crystal. Volunteer, we're getting paid weekly to go door to door and give out brochures. Oh, wow. Okay, why did they say don't say anything about getting paid under the table? I think, Crystal, for tax purposes, if they're paying you, you're technically campaign staff at that point, and so they're required to report that. So I think what they were doing was trying to avoid having to report extra staff, having to report, extra personnel. I mean, that was illegal, but they were probably trying not to report extra staff. Yeah. Yeah, usually if you're a volunteer, you do not get paid, but you get fed. Like, they'll provide meals, they'll give you like campaign signs, t-shirts, buttons, things like that. Caps. If you're doing like an internship for college, you'll get credit for that too. That's what some students do, is they use their internship, things like that. But usually it's just, you get paid in goods. When I volunteered, we got fed meals, we got buttons, stuff like that. Usually it's supposed to be like, here's some free campaign stuff and we'll feed you while you're out working for us. Okay. But the most important thing for a campaign is, of course, the money. Money, money, money. You'd better have the money to run. Even on the state level, it is incredibly expensive. In the 2002 gubernatorial race, the Democratic candidate spent $67 million, and the incumbent, Rick Perry, spent $28 million. Now, the challenger usually has to spend a lot more money because they're trying to take the seat from the incumbent. The incumbent has the advantage of name recognition, party funding, things like that, so they don't necessarily have to raise as much money. But it is expensive. You have to pay for your campaign staff. You have to pay for signs, billboards, ads. The minute you run out of money is the minute your campaign is done, right? That's why in presidential races, usually after Super Tuesday, a lot of candidates drop out. And we saw that happening this year, right? Pete Buttigieg and at least 2 others dropped out after Super Tuesday. If you don't have the money, you can't stay in the race. We've seen attorney general races where they spend $4.5 million. Yes. Okay, so sorry, I should have explained. Super Tuesday is in a presidential election. It's when about 15 states all hold their primaries on the same day. Yeah. So it's 15 states all voting for a presidential candidate on the same day. So for presidential candidates, you have to spend a ton of money on one Tuesday in 15 states. This is where most candidates run out of money because they're trying to spread it out across 15 different states. And if they don't win at least 2 of those states, there's no money left. Yeah, it's Texas, California, I can't remember the others, but Texas and California are two of the biggest that hold their elections on what they call Super Tuesday. So yeah, ours was March 3rd this year. Yeah, yeah. So it's really expensive for the candidates because they have to try and campaign in 15 states at the same time, which is not possible. So most of them run out of money, and that's the end of it.
And usually they say whoever drives Super Tuesday
what gets the nomination. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the problem is what happened was states used to have their primary spread out all the way through June of an election year. But the states that were later in the calendar were going, we don't get a say in who the nominee is, because by the time you get to June, usually you know who your presidential candidate is. But they kept pushing the campaign or the primaries forward and kept pushing it forward, and more states wanted to be competitive, so we ended up with 15 primaries on one day. Yeah. Honestly, they need to put an end to that. They need to spread them all back out and say, look, if we don't know who the nominee is until then, we don't know who the nominee is until then. That's how it's supposed to work. Give people an actual chance.
And this is that one state,
yeah,
one city to see that for a candidate.
Yeah.
So say Texas, that they would come to the November, everybody would come to be that president.
Yeah. Yeah. And they have to pick and choose where they're going to campaign. So they will focus on Texas. So they'll do like a quick swing through maybe Austin, San Antonio, maybe a quick appearance in Dallas, and then they'll have to go on to the next state. I think it was Bernie Sanders was going through 3 states in one day for Super Tuesday. Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like when you're watching the world news and you see this candidate on the train, and they're going from state to state. That's what they do. That's Super Tuesday.
Yeah. It's a nightmare for the candidates. Yeah. It's honestly it's not good for their health either, because they're crossing time zones, they're not sleeping, they're stressing out. It's really, really bad. Yeah. Sure. Super Tuesday was largely split between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. But because some of the other moderate candidates dropped out, Joe Biden was able to pick up their votes. So that's why he became the nominee. But early on, it was pretty well split between Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden. So they were kind of the last men standing until Biden got it. Yeah. There were like 15 candidates. The only truly viable ones were Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Pete Buttigieg, and probably, I would say, Elizabeth Warren were the only truly viable candidates in that race. And then pretty early on, Elizabeth Warren was knocked out of contention, and then Buttigieg dropped out, so it became Biden versus Sanders, and Biden won. Yeah. Yeah, of course. No, these are great questions. Don't hesitate to ask. Okay. Part of the problem too is only presidential candidates are publicly funded, and most of the time they don't even get the funding. So you're relying on people to help fund your campaign, but not necessarily the voters. You're relying on corporations, interest groups, the parties. Problematic. We really should have publicly funded campaigns. Other countries give the parties public funding. Honestly, we should do the same thing. We should say, here's this much money for the Democrats, the Republicans, and third parties, and we can give it to the candidates and we fund it, because it would remove special interest. It would allow non-wealthy people to be able to vote. It would stop tying candidates to groups that say, we helped get you elected, now you owe us a favor. We really, in my opinion, need to remove money from politics. And the more money you spend, the more attention you get, and the more likely you are to win, right? If you're a candidate who can afford to spend $50 million on Super Tuesday, you're probably going to win most of the states. The more money you spend, the more name recognition there is, the more likely you are to win. If it had been strictly a money campaign, in all likelihood, Michael Bloomberg would have been the Democratic candidate because he was out spending every day. But most people were annoyed that there was this corporate guy kind of honing in on the Democratic primaries. But he's already spending his own money for Democrats. He actually recently just spent something like $32,000 to help people in Florida pay off their fees, the felons pay off their fees so they can vote. So he's trying to get voter turnout that way. But he was the one whose ads ran the most, right? Nothing but Bloomberg ads for a while. Just freaking annoying, but there you go. Okay. So I do want to show you just one other kind of thing. Just so we can, because we're talking about voter turnout and all of that. Okay. Yeah. So this is what they call an exit poll. This is essentially figuring out who participated in Texas. Of course, it was super close between Beto O'Rourke and Ted Cruz. Here's why Cruz won. Okay, gender-wise, it was pretty evenly split. Although, of course, you can see women tended to vote more for Beto versus men. Pretty even turnout there, right? Where we see the biggest problem is essentially in age, right? If you take a look, young people overwhelmingly supported Beto O'Rourke. They didn't show up. 8%, 7% versus older voters, right? Because young people didn't show up to vote, even though they overwhelmingly voted for Beto, in the end, this is what helped Cruz hold on to a seat. Okay. Yeah, I feel working. No, not helping me make my point. Alright, hang on, let me stop sharing this for a minute, see if I can get it to work. Yeah, I'll do that. Okay. Yes, if you have you can go ahead and ask the question if you have one, or comment, and if you have a question. No problem. No problem. Alright, so see how super close it was, guys? Yeah, it was really close. It was really, really close. Okay. There we go. Okay. And so I'll go back to sharing this. Okay. Okay. Darn it, it didn't. Really, technology. Okay. Okay. Great. Okay. Minorities, again, overwhelmingly voting for Beto O'Rourke. 12%, 26%, 56%. And that is part of what made the difference, right? Yes. Yeah, that's the percentage of Hispanic voters that showed up, 26%.
And then that percent is the.
Correct. So out of 26%, 64% voted for Beto O'Rourke and 35% for Ted Cruz. Yeah. So this percentage here is the percent of eligible voters from that group that showed up, and then this is out of that group the percentage who voted for Beto versus Cruz. All right. So as you can see, obviously, it was the fact that we saw more white Texans showing up that made the difference. Education-wise, it wasn't as big a split as they were thinking. It was pretty close. Usually it's a little different, but that's not quite what we saw. Income-wise, we did see, that wasn't too different, but okay. I'm going to go back up to the top and show governors, where's the Senate? Okay. So these are the various counties and how they voted. As you can see, right, most of Lower Texas fairly blue. Hidalgo, Cameron County went for Beto. Hidalgo County also overwhelmingly blue. Switch. Willacy County. Yeah, so the Rio Grande Valley does tend to go blue usually. Yeah, so yeah, and then you see areas like, there's probably pockets like this is probably around San Antonio and areas that were blue. Obviously, so I don't think anyone can really say Texas is completely a red state. It's really starting to look more purple.
Yeah.
All right, we're starting to see. Yeah. Williamson County. Yeah, trying to find San Antonio. Yeah, no, I'm trying. Sorry, I'm trying to find it on here. There we go. Yeah, Bear County, and then it disappeared. But you see kind of what I'm talking about, right? And if we did have more voter turnout here, that might make a difference as well. It's just something to keep in mind, right? It's just kind of, when we talk about voter turnout, I mean, it was super close, but in the end, obviously, because there was higher turnout amongst older voters and white voters, yeah, that's why Ted Cruz won. But yeah, it's the moral of the story is get people out to vote as much as you can, and if you're Democrats in the state, for the love of God, come to the Rio Grande Valley. Stop ignoring us. Anyway, yes, done ranting, somewhat. Okay. Any questions on that? Nope. Okay, any questions or comments online? Sorry, Evelyn, can't hear you. Can you repeat that, please?
I wanted to ask, how long did the paper have to?
The proposal or the actual paper?
The actual paper.
The actual paper needs to be 5 pages double spaced.
Okay, and the proposal, it's just like explaining our topic and what we're going to be focusing on?
Correct, your topic, why you chose it, and the 2 sources, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, so you only need to submit about like a paragraph by tonight. That's all that's due today. It's just what you're going to write that 5-page paper on. And also, as you're writing the paper, if you want me to look at a rough draft or you're like, does this make sense? Am I on the right track? I'd be happy to take a look at it for you. So if you want me to look at a rough draft, or you want to talk about the paper, we can set up an appointment and we can meet and talk about it. Okay. We will finish up elections on Monday. Of course, you in the room will be online. So just make sure you read the second half of Chapter 5 for Monday. Make sure I get your paper proposal by midnight tonight. And if you have any questions, Blackboard right now, it's being funky. It's not letting me know when you guys send me a message. So if it's something important, just send me a regular email for now, because Blackboard's being a little finicky. You can email me or you can call or text my cell phone. Okay? So your weekend,